Hello, everyone. This is a video overview introducing the research paper for Summer 1 or Summer 2. This is the shorter summer session that lasts 4.5 weeks. So the very first thing that we have in the unit is the assignment sheet. And you'll want to not only read this, but I highly recommend that you print it out so that you can access it as needed when you're drafting. So let me go ahead and make this full screen so that we can talk about what the actual assignment is. You'll notice at the top I have two grab and go prompts, the first of which is an argument of definition that basically asks the question, what is happiness? Now, you might be asking yourself how we can write an argument about the subject of happiness, because just on the surface, it doesn't seem like it would be argumentative, but there's plenty of things to discuss and debate that are not established facts, and that's the basis of this paper. The very first one centers on probably one of the biggest questions in happiness studies, and that is the question of what is it? How do we define it? And the more we read and the more sources you encounter, you will see that there are different philosophies, different schools of thought, and different definitions as to what happiness actually is. And we do have readings in the course. We're going to read two things together, two separate articles. One of those is called The Quest for Happiness, and that source is particularly well suited as a potential source for this one, for number one. The second prompt on the assignment sheet basically asks students to write a documented argument that develops and supports a stance about the extent to which suffering and adversity might actually be important to or vital for a person's happiness. Most of the time we think of those things as negative emotions or negative experience, and we typically think of them as barriers to happiness, not necessarily vital components for it. So one thing you notice with the first two grab and go prompts is that they are inherently argumentative and debatable by the very nature of the questions and claims that they present. The third option is open-ended, and an open-ended thesis would be something that you developed after you've done some preliminary pre-writing, and that's thinking on paper. There's a number of techniques that you can use for that. Sometimes you can stumble onto an interesting research question or idea that might lead to a thesis that makes a debatable claim about some aspect of happiness. And another way to develop a more open-ended claim, or a claim that stems from a more open-ended search, would be to do some preliminary research, informal research, to kind of see what's out there, to see what's under discussion, what's open to debate, what kinds of things have not been settled, or what kinds of things or topics in happiness have these debatable elements at their core. All right, so keep in mind that we're in a 4.5 week term, and we're about the halfway mark there. So the remainder of the semester we'll be spending on this research paper. Just so you know, in long term, which lasts 15 weeks of regular instruction, plus a week for final exams, we spend at least a third, maybe a little bit more than a third of the semester on this paper. So that's about 6 weeks. We'll be doing this in just a little over 2 weeks. So it's going to be a very fast pace, but I'm going to do my very best to break things down to make them as manageable as I possibly can. But it's also going to be very important that you work smartly and that you take me up on some of the suggestions that will make your life easier for this paper. So let's scroll down a little bit and see what the requirements are. The requirements are that this is a 10-page research paper, and that doesn't count the works cited page, which is the bibliography. In a normal long semester, the minimum length is a little bit shorter than this because in a regular semester, we have 3 papers, but in a session that is as short as the one that we're in, I reduced the number of papers by 1 so that we have 2 papers, and I'm fudging a little bit because the first paper that you were assigned, which was over a short story, I put that one at 4. Normally I have to bump that up so that we can meet our minimum, but that's the only concession that I made. So I still had to bump up the page requirement here so that we can meet or come close to meeting the minimum number of pages that we're required to write over the course of the semester. And that's set by the English department and not me. We're really supposed to write 17 pages, 16 pages. We've revised it to, but in this semester, we'll be writing a total of 14, 10 for this one and 4 for the first paper. All right, so 10 pages for this one. We have a minimum of 7 required sources, and the sources that we use in our paper, they must come from the STC databases and TED Talks. I also have a documentary in the course. You're welcome to use that. It's also available on Tubi in this current semester, and Tubi is a streaming platform, which you probably know that's free, but it has commercials typically in it, and that's kind of the catch there, but that's a very good documentary. So you use articles from the databases, TED Talks. The articles that we have in the course, those are from the STC databases, so they're already from that. So if you use those plus some TED Talks, it's pretty easy to get your 7 sources, but you can't choose any sources at all until you first choose a topic, till you first develop a working thesis, and you can't develop a working thesis until you've done some preliminary thinking, pre-writing, and preliminary research. We'll talk more about that later. This paper is an argument, though, and I want to remind everybody that it has to be structured as such. One of the biggest pitfalls is that sometimes students will choose a topic, and it's something where they have a claim that they support, but that claim is not debatable. And if that claim is not debatable, then what you write will not end up being an argument, and that's a fundamental requirement of this. If somebody wrote an expository paper that just explains or is kind of like a report in nature, or if it's something along those lines, then it won't meet the requirements of being an argument. All right, let's look at a few more things, and then I'm going to point you to some things that you're going to want to refer to, especially once you start researching. Later, when you're drafting, you're going to want to come back and look at this top part here so you can see some of the things that we have there in terms of what pertains to drafting. One thing I want to point your attention to right now, these are sources to avoid when you're looking at sources to actually use in your paper. So you can't use any sources that you haven't personally read from cover to cover and vetted and evaluated as suitable and relevant, and making sure that it follows all of the rules stipulated for this paper. So avoid the temptation. Sometimes I have students that will choose sources that just have the word happiness in them. They kind of skim the abstract or skim the article, and they end up choosing it without really vetting it and determining if it's relevant, if it's good, if it's a keeper. So that's number one. You should never choose any source that you don't fully understand. Sometimes I have students that'll do that. They'll choose a really hard, dense, peer-reviewed, scholarly article, and sometimes they have chosen articles they don't fully understand. I've had students bring me articles before that I've glanced at, and I've told them honestly, I don't understand this. This is crazy. So don't use anything that you don't personally understand. No encyclopedia articles. No book reviews. You can't use a book review of a book that you haven't read, so be careful. You can't use those. You can't use encyclopedia articles. You can't use annotated bibliographies or literature reviews. So and you're going to learn about annotated bibliographies because I'm going to have you do one. But basically what they are, it's a document where somebody has researched a subject deeply and they put the bibliographic information for that given source so you can find it. They summarize it and they evaluate it. So you can't use somebody else's summary of something. That's why you can't use book reviews. You can't use annotated bibliographies or literature reviews. Abstracts, which when you click on articles in the databases, there's generally an abstract at the beginning, which is just basically a paragraph summary of the article, and that's meant to help researchers and students when they're looking for a source so they can kind of see what's the upshot of that article to even determine if it's worth their while to read. So you can't use those. You can't use one-page articles or overly short articles, and you shouldn't use overly long articles either. That's kind of common sense, or it should be in general, but it should especially be a guiding principle in a course that's 4.5 weeks. That's normally 15 weeks, 16 if you count the final exam. So you want articles that have some substance to them and that are useful, that you can get some mileage out of. But we're looking for the Goldilocks principle here, something that's not too long, not too short. You'll see the 2 articles that we have in the course. Those are nice sweet spots. They're not long, they're not hard to understand, but you do have to pay attention. For most things that you use in a paper, you have to read them multiple times and carefully and take notes and annotate and all of those things. So just kind of use your common sense. I would say a good rule of thumb is, some things that's, 5 to 10 pages. Try not to choose anything that is longer than that. If you've got a good one that's 4 or 5 or 6, that's even better. We can't have any web sources from the regular internet, even though I'm going to have a whole lesson where I'm going to show you how to find stuff on the regular internet, but those are basically serve 2 different purposes. Number one, that preliminary or informal research will help you see what's out there, will help you kind of see what the issues, what the debates are. You'll find some really interesting things, but I want to also show you how to find some things that you could use in your paper and that you can back search in the databases to find. And so it's a shortcut, easier way to find articles that are likely to be in the databases. You find those and you get the title, the author, you go in and you look and you find those. And oftentimes searching on the regular internet or even leveraging AI in some cases, which I'll show on the internet, can be a lot faster than the databases, which have vast resources, but sometimes there's a bit of a frustration factor in there. And I can't circumvent all of it, but I can circumvent or help you learn some tricks that will help with that. All right, but in terms of any sources that you're actually using in your paper, you can't have any from the regular web with few exceptions, and any of those sections require my prior approval. So don't just choose it or zone out and forget, because I've had some students where they basically have all web sources and then they learn deeper into the process that they have to that they can't use any of those, especially if they did not look in the places that I suggested that are likely to be in the databases. So be careful. One exception to this, there is a World Happiness Report that comes out every year. It's a really long document and it's divided into chapters, but they have different focal points. That's a really good source if there's anything in there that's relevant excuse me, to something that you're interested in. If so, that's okay. If you see something else, then reach out and ask, and we'll take a look at it. This is a big one right here. We also don't want any articles that are specific to other cultures or other countries or special populations unless that has a specific and direct bearing on your thesis. So what that means is that, like I've had some people that will explore some really specific aspect of like a geriatric population in Turkey and who live in a nursing home and the impact of those things on their happiness. Well, those things are so the special population of, geriatric, the geriatric population in Turkey living in a nursing home. That is so super specific that sometimes students are just looking in such haste. They're choosing something like that and trying to force it into their paper, but I don't want to see any of those things in your paper unless that specific culture or country has specific bearing on your thesis. And we also shouldn't be using any books at all. All your sources have to be something that you can supply me with. And in a normal regular semester, I do allow students to use like a chapter out of an ebook from the STC databases, but nothing more than that, because even in a long semester, students don't have time to read a book in its entirety to use a whole book as a foundation or as a big part of their paper. But for this 4.5-week class, I'm nixing this at all. You really shouldn't be using a chapter out of a book at all. If you see a chapter out of a book, keep in mind those chapters are going to be 30 or 40 pages long at least. So we just need to not do that. So we should just focus on articles and TED Talks. So that's it. I'm going to wrap. This is the introduction to the happiness essay. I want to say maybe a couple more things before I wrap this video. We still are going to follow the whole process here, but it's going to be very compressed, and there's going to be a lot more work than there was in the first 2 weeks of class where we worked with one paper. So there's going to be a lot of reading, a lot of watching videos, a lot of thinking about and developing a working thesis, a lot of research, a lot of vetting of sources and things like that. We're going to create an annotated bibliography, which is where you'll present to me your thesis, your sources. It's a very specific process. And you'll also be developing an outline before we draft. And the one thing that I'm going to do to really help us with the draft is I'm going to break that up into teeny tiny little segments so that we can stay on a pace. And it's going to be a lot. It's going to be intense, but I don't think it's going to be anything that anybody can't do. But you are going to have to roll up your sleeves, lace up your tennis shoes, because we're going to be busy, really busy, and the workload is going to be much, much heavier this week, next week, and all the way until we get to the end of the semester. But I'm here to help everybody. I think we're going to make it through in one piece, but I just wanted to tell you that all of this is, what we're looking at for the happiness essay, and we're doing all of this on a much more compressed schedule than we would be doing in a regular semester. We're doing this in about 2.5 weeks when a regular semester has 5 to 6 weeks, depending. So you can kind of imagine that you're going to have something due pretty much every day. Some days you might have a couple of things, a usual quiz and something else. You might have a couple of things due on a given day. So that's it. That's a wrap. This is what we're looking at. I hope y'all have a great day. And as always, don't hesitate to reach out if you have any questions.